The baby had been screaming for 3 hours straight. Not crying, screaming. The kind of raw, piercing sound that cut through engines, champagne glasses, and human patience. Passengers in first class shifted in their leather seats, shooting daggers with their eyes. One man muttered, "This is exactly why babies shouldn't be allowed up here." Another rolled her eyes so hard it could have snapped bone. Even the pilot's polite announcement about a comfortable journey for all felt like a public indictment. And at the center of it, billionaire Ethan Cole stood helpless in the aisle, bouncing his 6-month-old daughter Grace in his arms. His shirt was damp with sweat, his jaw tight with desperation. He had closed billion-dollar deals, built an empire on algorithms and AI. But here, 35,000 feet in the air, he couldn't do the one thing that mattered: calm his own child. "Please, sweetheart," he whispered into her tiny ear, voice cracking. "Please." But Grace only screamed louder. And that was when, from the curtains separating first class from economy, a young black woman stepped forward. Calm, steady, eyes fixed on the chaos like she'd seen it before. "May I try?" she asked. For a split second, no one moved. A first-class attendant shifted, ready to block the young woman. Her clothes were simple: joggers, a faded sweater, a scarf holding back her curls. She didn't look like she belonged in this cabin of status and steel. But her voice, steady, low, unshaken, cut through the baby's cries. "May I try?" Ethan looked at her, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. He wanted to say no, to cling to pride, to control. But he was drowning, and she was offering a hand. "Yes," he whispered. "Please." Amara stepped forward, ignoring the stares. She held her palms open, waiting. Ethan hesitated, every instinct of fatherhood telling him not to hand his child to a stranger. But Grace screamed again, arching in his arms, and desperation crushed hesitation. He gave her over. The cabin leaned in. Wealthy passengers who hadn't paid attention to anyone outside their circle for years now watched like witnesses to a trial. Amara shifted Grace into position, face down along her forearm, head supported, belly resting against warmth. With her other hand, she pressed gently, rhythmically, along the baby's back. Not frantic pats. Not clumsy rocking. Precise, calm, measured. And then she hummed. It wasn't a lullaby anyone recognized. It was older, earthier, the kind of song that carried memory in its bones. Within 30 seconds, Grace's shrieks collapsed into hiccups. Then into whimpers. Then into silence so sudden it felt impossible. The cabin froze. Forks suspended mid-air. The man in 1A lowered his newspaper, staring. The socialite in 2C, who had been texting furiously, blinked like someone waking from a dream. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. How did you do that?" Amara's smile was small, not triumphant, just certain. "I've seen this before. My nephew had colic. Sometimes it's pressure in the belly, sometimes overstimulation. This helps them release it." She kept humming, fingers steady. Grace's eyes fluttered open, glassy but calm, and for the first time in hours, she looked at her father instead of screaming past him. Ethan's throat tightened. A billionaire on paper, and yet in this moment, he felt like the poorest man alive, saved by a stranger with nothing more than patience, skill, and a song. Around them, the cabin exhaled as if the baby's peace belonged to everyone. But Ethan barely noticed. His eyes were locked on Amara. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low, urgent, like the answer might matter more than any contract waiting in London. She looked back at him, calm and unflinching. "Amara Williams," she said simply. "I'm a nursing student. From Chicago." And then, as if to prove that miracles could be temporary, Grace stirred in her arms. softly this time, not with violence but with the sigh of a child who had found safety. Ethan realized then that the crying wasn't the story. The story was standing right in front of him, steady and unshaken, holding his world together with nothing but open hands. For the first time in hours, first class was silent. The hum of engines returned as the only soundtrack, wrapping the cabin in uneasy awe. People still stole glances toward row 2A, unable to believe the storm had ended so quickly. Ethan sat down slowly, as if afraid a wrong movement would wake the nightmare again. Grace rested in Amara's arms, her tiny breaths sinking to the rhythm of the lullaby that lingered faintly in the air. "Amara," Ethan repeated, his voice softer now, testing the name. She nodded. "Yes. I'm studying nursing. Almost finished. Babies don't scare me anymore." He let out something between a laugh and a sigh. "They terrify me." The admission surprised him. Billionaires don't confess fear, at least not in public. But here, 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, stripped of pride and pretense, he found himself telling a stranger the truth. Amara adjusted Grace gently, her movements practiced, confident. "Most parents feel like this. Money doesn't make babies easier, Mr. Cole." He looked at her sharply. "You know who I am. Everyone on this plane knows who you are," she said, not unkindly. "But right now, you're just a father who needed help." The words pierced him deeper than any headline ever had. He wanted to respond, to thank her, to explain, but Grace stirred, and Amara's attention returned fully to the child. Her fingers traced slow circles on the baby's back until she sighed back into sleep. Ethan watched, his chest tightening. How could someone so young carry that kind of calm? "Are you traveling to London for school?" he asked quietly, not wanting to break the fragile peace. Amara hesitated, then shook her head. "Not school. A conference. Community health programs. We're sharing ideas about how to support children in underserved neighborhoods." Her voice carried no bitterness, only purpose. But Ethan heard what she didn't say: limited resources, uphill battles, doors closed to people like her. He studied her face. She couldn't have been more than 27. Yet there was a gravity in her eyes, the kind born from long nights and harder choices. For a moment, Ethan saw himself reflected there. Not as the billionaire, not as the executive in control of everything, but as the man who once clawed his way out of a Detroit factory town. He remembered what it felt like to be underestimated, to be invisible. And here she was, steady as a lighthouse, holding his daughter like she'd been born for this moment. "Amara," he said again, slower this time. "I don't know how to thank you." She finally looked at him, straight on. "You don't need to. Just remember this: sometimes the people you overlook are the ones holding you together." Ethan had no answer. Only silence. The rest of the cabin began to stir again. Champagne poured, laptops reopened, the performance of normalcy resuming. But for Ethan Cole, nothing was normal. He didn't know it yet, but when the wheels touched down in London, he would make a decision that would change both their lives forever. Amara Williams was 27, born and raised on the south side of Chicago. Her story didn't start in boardrooms or private schools. It started in a 2-bedroom apartment where she shared space with her mother and 2 younger siblings. Her father had left long ago. Her mother worked double shifts as a nurse's aide, coming home with tired eyes and hands that smelled of antiseptic. And so Amara grew up fast. She became the second parent, cooking, tutoring, keeping her brother and sister safe when bills piled high and options ran low. She knew what it meant to sacrifice. Sometimes it was her own meals. Sometimes it was sleep. And sometimes it was her own dreams. But even in that wait, something grew inside her, a conviction. She saw neighbors skipping doctor visits because they couldn't afford them. She saw coughs turn into crises, small pains into emergencies. And she told herself, no child should suffer just because their family is poor. That promise shaped her future. Amara pushed her way through school, working nights as a caregiver, mornings in a community clinic, and afternoons buried in books. She chose nursing, not because it was easy, but because she knew the faces behind every illness. She knew what it felt like to be unseen. Her dream was bigger than herself, to build a community health center for mothers and children, a place where no one would be turned away. A place where tired parents could find hope, and sick children could find healing without shame. But along with that dream came battles she fought in silence. The constant exhaustion. The pride that made her refuse help, even when she needed it. The quiet doubt that whispered, maybe you're chasing something impossible. And yet, every time she calmed a baby in her arms, every time a mother said thank you with tears in her eyes, Amara knew she couldn't stop. She was calm like stone, fierce like fire, and steady like steel. Invisible to some, until the day she stepped into first class, held a stranger's crying child, and proved she was never invisible at all. The wheels touched down at Heathrow with the dull thunder of rubber on runway. Ethan hadn't slept. Grace had, thanks to Amara, but his own mind had been racing, replaying the moment in the cabin like a loop he couldn't escape. She wasn't just a stranger who calmed his child. She was a woman who'd walked into a world that didn't want her there and, with nothing but steady hands and quiet courage, turned judgment into silence. By the time the car swept them through the grey streets of London toward the Langham Hotel, Ethan already knew. He couldn't let this connection end with baggage claim. Inside the gleaming lobby, chandeliers dripping light onto marble, Amara shifted uneasily. Her joggers and sweater stood out against polished suits and silk dresses. She wasn't intimidated, just aware. She had lived long enough to know when a place whispered you don't belong here. Grace stirred in her stroller. Amara crouched instinctively, smoothing a small hand over the baby's chest until she settled again. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. In the suite upstairs, with views stretching over Hyde Park, Ethan finally spoke what had been pressing against his ribs since the plane. Amara, he began carefully, I have meetings this week, meetings I can't move. And I can't bring Grace into boardrooms. You've seen how she trusts you. More than she trusts me, if I'm honest. Amara looked at him, cautious. Mr. Cole. Ethan, he corrected quickly. Please. Ethan, she said, the name firm, grounded. I helped on the plane because your daughter needed comfort, not because I'm looking for work. I know, he said. That's what makes me ask. I'd like to hire you, just for these 5 days in London. To stay nearby, help with Grace while I'm in meetings. I'll pay fairly. You'll have time for your own commitments too. Amara straightened, arms folding lightly. Her pride surfaced, the same pride that had carried her through years of exhaustion. You don't have to offer me charity. It's not charity, Ethan said, leaning forward. His voice was softer now, stripped of the authority that had built his empire. It's partnership. You give Grace peace. That's worth more than anything I can pay for in this city. And he hesitated, surprising himself with honesty. I think I need your presence more than I realized. The room went still. For a moment, Amara searched his face, weighing the truth against the possibility of pity. But she didn't see pity in his eyes. She saw sincerity, maybe even humility. Finally, she let out a long breath. 5 days. But on my terms. I'm attending a health conference while I'm here. I won't give that up. And I won't be treated like a servant. I'll care for Grace. But my dignity isn't for sale. Ethan's lips curved, not in amusement but in relief. That's exactly why I want you here. Grace gurgled in her stroller, as if seconding the decision. Amara crouched again, her face softening as she touched the baby's tiny hand. And Ethan Cole, who had thought this trip would be defined by contracts and numbers, realized something unsettling. The most important negotiation of his week had just ended in a quiet London hotel suite, with a woman who refused to be invisible. London moved like a machine, black cars, sharp suits, meetings stacked back to back. Ethan slipped into that rhythm easily, like muscle memory. 4 years, this had been his battlefield. Boardrooms, contracts, billion-dollar negotiations. Yet now, whenever he looked down at his watch between presentations, his thoughts wandered not to numbers, but to the woman who had stayed behind with his daughter. Amara's world that week looked nothing like his. In the suite, she discovered that Grace wasn't just a restless baby. She was curious, alert, hungry to understand everything around her. Amara turned bottles and blocks into lessons, tracing little patterns with toys, teaching rhythm with claps and gentle songs. 2 red blocks, 2 blue blocks, she whispered, stacking them in front of Grace. The baby gurgled, reaching for the next color. That's right, Amara said softly, as if talking to her own siblings years ago. When Grace finally napped, Amara would slip away to the conference center across town, blending into rows of students and professionals, notebook in hand. She asked sharp questions, spoke about community clinics, and listened with intensity that made strangers pause. She was invisible in first class, but here her presence lit the room. Back at the hotel, Ethan's assistant reported on the meetings. The European investors are cautious. They want proof your AI expansion won't collapse under regulation. Ethan nodded, answering in his usual precision. But under the polished mask, something had shifted. For the first time, he compared the sterile questions of investors with the fierce, living questions Amara had posed about children, families, dignity. That evening, he returned early. The suite was quiet, save for a soft hum coming from the nursery corner. Amara was there, rocking Grace against her shoulder, eyes half closed, voice carrying a lullaby Ethan had heard on the plane. He watched for a moment, unseen. A billionaire, standing still in his own hotel room, watching a woman whose presence made his world feel less hollow. When she noticed him, she smiled lightly. She fought sleep again. But I won. You always do, Ethan said quietly, surprising himself with the warmth in his tone. They sat across from each other, Grace finally asleep between them. For a while, they spoke like people who had forgotten titles, about childhoods, about mothers who worked too much, about the strange weight of responsibility. Ethan confessed he had once been a factory worker's son in Detroit. Amara shared how she had carried siblings through school when money was scarce. Different cities, different stories, but the same scars of struggle. It was then Ethan realized the distance between first class and economy was smaller than the distance between truth and the masks they wore. And as London's lights glowed beyond the glass, he found himself wondering if this woman had been placed in his path not just to help his daughter, but to help him remember who he was before power, before pride, before forgetting what mattered. The dining room shimmered with crystal and low conversation, the kind of place where decisions worth billions were made over seared salmon and Bordeaux. Ethan had sat at countless tables like this, but tonight he felt a strange tension. His daughter was asleep upstairs. Amara was meant to stay with her. Yet when one of the investors asked a casual question, "How's fatherhood treating you, Cole?" the words hit harder than he expected. He almost answered with a rehearsed smile. Instead, he thought of Amara's calm voice and her steady hands. "Different than I imagined," he said quietly. "Harder. And better." The table chuckled politely. But Ethan's mind was somewhere else. Half an hour later, a commotion at the entrance caught his attention. Amara stood there, hesitant, almost retreating when she saw the room filled with suits and diamonds. One of the staff had clearly guided her in after she'd asked to find Ethan. She wore the same scarf, the same simple clothes, but her presence outshone the polished walls. Ethan rose before anyone could whisper. "Excuse me," he said, and crossed the room to meet her. "Is Grace?" "She's fine," Amara reassured quickly. "Sleeping sound. I just came back from the conference. I thought you should hear what they're talking about." He hesitated. Bringing her here was unorthodox, dangerous, even. But something in her urgency, in the fire behind her calm, made him turn toward the table. "Gentlemen, ladies," Ethan said, guiding her forward. "This is Amara Williams. She knows more about children and communities than most policymakers I've met. And she has something worth saying." The air tightened, half curiosity, half disbelief. A billionaire introducing a stranger from economy class to a table of investors? It had never happened before. Amara's voice trembled at first, but only for a breath. "At the conference today, we talked about families who don't have access to basic healthcare. About mothers working 2 jobs who can't afford checkups for their babies. We spoke of children who fall behind, not because they lack intelligence, but because no one teaches their parents how to guide them through the first years of life." The room stilled. Forks paused mid-air. "And here's the truth," Amara continued, her tone deepening, steady now. "Technology won't matter if we forget people. Innovation won't matter if children grow up invisible. The real investment, the one that lasts, is in human lives." Her words weren't polished, not rehearsed like Ethan's pitches. But they struck harder than numbers ever could. Because they were lived. Because they were true. Ethan looked around the table. Men who prided themselves on data were suddenly silent. Women who measured success in market shares had softened eyes. The truth had broken through their armor. And as Amara finished with nothing more than, "That's all I wanted to share," Ethan saw what he hadn't seen before. Not just a nursing student, not just a caregiver, but a leader. A seed had been planted in the heart of that glittering room. One that would grow in ways none of them could yet imagine. And in Ethan's chest, something else began to grow, too. Not attraction alone. Not admiration alone. Something deeper. Something dangerous. Something he hadn't let himself feel in years. London at night was a blur of headlights and rain-slick streets. By the time Ethan returned to the suite, the echoes of Amara's words still rang in his mind. Investors who had walked into that dinner with folded arms had leaned forward by the end. Not because of him, but because of her. Grace was awake, restless again. Amara sat cross-legged on the floor, humming softly while the baby clutched at her scarf. The sight stopped Ethan at the door. A billionaire, frozen in the frame of his own life, watching a woman who seemed to carry both strength and serenity in the same breath. "You left the table stunned tonight," he said quietly as he stepped inside. Amara glanced up, brushing a curl from her face. "I wasn't trying to. I couldn't stay silent." "That's exactly why they listened," Ethan replied. "No agenda. No performance. Just truth." For a long while, the only sound was Grace's soft coos. Then Amara spoke again, more carefully this time. "Ethan, you live in a world where people measure worth in numbers. But I've seen numbers fail. Families scraping to survive. A child's fever rising while a mother counts the dollars in her purse. You can't calculate dignity on a spreadsheet." Her words cut deeper than any critique he'd faced in boardrooms. Because she wasn't arguing, she was reminding him of something he'd once known and lost. "I grew up in Detroit," he confessed, lowering himself onto the couch. "Factory father. Mother cleaned houses. I used to believe money would solve everything. Then I made more than I could ever spend, and I still felt empty." Amara studied him, her eyes steady, not dazzled by his confession. "Money doesn't heal emptiness. People do." Grace stirred, and Ethan reached for her clumsily. She whimpered, but Amara guided his hands. "Here, support her head. Gentle pressure. She needs to feel secure." He followed, awkward at first, then steadier as Grace nestled against his chest. For the first time in days, she relaxed in his arms without crying. Ethan's throat tightened, not at the baby's calm, but at the quiet pride in Amara's eyes. "You see the world differently," he said. "No," she answered softly. "I just refuse to look away." The city glowed outside the glass, but inside the suite, time slowed. The billionaire and the woman who had entered his life by chance sat in silence, bound by a fragile thread of honesty neither had expected. It wasn't romance yet. It wasn't even trust. But it was the beginning of something both of them feared and needed, the possibility of belonging. Rain streaked down the tall windows of the suite, blurring the glow of London's skyline into smears of gold and gray. Inside, the room was quiet, too quiet for a man like Ethan Cole, who was used to noise. Phones ringing, voices demanding, deals moving. Tonight, there was only the soft hum of a lullaby. He found Amara on the carpet, cross-legged, with Grace tucked against her shoulder. The baby's tiny hand clutched a fold of her scarf, as if refusing to let go. Amara rocked gently, her voice low, warm, steady. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. He just watched, struck by how natural she looked in a space that wasn't hers, doing what even he, her father, could not. "You left them speechless tonight," Ethan finally said. His voice was softer than he intended, as though the hush of the room demanded reverence. Amara lifted her gaze, a strand of hair falling loose across her cheek. She smiled faintly, but there was no pride in it. Only truth. "I wasn't trying to impress them. I just couldn't sit there and say nothing." Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his face. "That's what makes it powerful. You didn't have an angle. No performance. Just raw truth. And somehow, it cut deeper than anything I've pitched in years." She studied him in silence. Then, her voice slowed. "Your world measures everything in numbers, stocks, markets, valuations. But I've seen numbers fail. I've seen a mother counting coins while her baby burned with fever. I've seen families cut medicine in half to make it last one more week. Tell me, Ethan, what number explains that?" The words hit harder than any investor's critique. Because they weren't hypothetical, they were lived. He sat down on the couch across from her, his polished posture unraveling. "I used to think money was the answer. I grew up in Detroit. My father worked the line, my mother cleaned houses. I swore I'd never struggle again. I chased wealth until I drowned in it. And still," his voice faltered, "still I feel empty." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't look at him the way others did, awed, deferential, calculating. She looked at him as if she saw the boy beneath the empire. "Money doesn't fill emptiness," she said softly. "People do." Grace stirred then, restless in her sleep. Ethan instinctively leaned forward, reaching for her. She whimpered, twisting in discomfort. Amara leaned closer, guiding his hands. "Support her head. Gentle pressure here," she whispered, adjusting his arms with patient precision. He followed clumsily, afraid he'd do it wrong. But slowly, Grace nestled against his chest, her tiny breaths syncing with his heartbeat. The sudden peace in her face nearly broke him. He swallowed hard, blinking faster than he should. Amara watched quietly, and in her gaze he saw no judgment, only a quiet pride. A warmth that stripped away the armor he wore in every other room of his life. "You see the world differently," he murmured. She shook her head, her voice almost a whisper. "No. I just refuse to look away." The rain tapped steady against the windows. The baby slept. And in that fragile silence, something shifted, something Ethan hadn't let himself feel in years. It wasn't romance, not yet. But it was intimacy. Real. Unscripted. The kind that makes two strangers suddenly aware of the space between them, and how thin that space had become. Morning sunlight spilled through the curtains of the suite, soft and golden. Grace was already awake, babbling with a kind of joy that made even the most exhausted mornings bearable. Ethan bent down, trying to mimic the sounds, but she only laughed and stretched her arms toward Amara. Ethan couldn't help but smile, though there was a shadow behind it. "She trusts you more than me." Amara shook her head gently. "No. She just knows I've held 100 babies like her. You'll catch up." She handed Grace back, guiding Ethan's hands again. "She doesn't need perfection. Just presence." The words sank deeper than she intended. Ethan held Grace close, awkward but steady, and for the first time felt her relax fully in his arms. It was as if Amara had given him not just instruction, but permission to believe he could be enough. That afternoon, when Grace finally drifted into her nap, Ethan found himself lingering at the small table where Amara sat scribbling in her notebook. He noticed the pages filled with sketches, outlines of a building, lists of medical supplies, budgets written in margins. "What's this?" he asked. She hesitated, then pushed the notebook toward him. "My dream. A community health center. Free care for mothers and children. A place where no one gets turned away." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed something more fragile. "But dreams cost more than I'll ever have." Ethan traced the rough sketches with his eyes, stunned by the detail, the care in every line. "You've planned this down to the last bandage." Amara gave a half smile. "Planning is easy. Reality is harder. I work double shifts. I pay bills. And I tell myself maybe someday. But someday feels like a lie some nights." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. The billionaire, who had signed checks larger than entire budgets of small towns, suddenly felt humbled by the simplicity of what she was reaching for. He closed the notebook gently. "When I was a boy, my father used to say the same thing. Someday. Someday we'll move out of this neighborhood. Someday life will be easier." I hated that word. So I swore I'd erase it. And now here I am, with all the money I once thought would change everything, and I'm still chasing somedays. The silence between them grew thick, not heavy, but intimate. Two different worlds, confessing the same emptiness. Amara leaned back, studying him. Maybe the trick isn't chasing someday. Maybe it's choosing today. The words lingered like a dare. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, the distance between billionaire and nurse, between luxury suite and small apartment, seemed paper-thin. Grace stirred softly in her crib, as if reminding them she was the reason they had met at all. The bridge between two lives that never should have touched, but now had. And in that quiet, something unspoken passed between Ethan and Amara. Not romance yet, not promises. Just the fragile beginning of trust, and the unmistakable sense that the world would never look the same again. London had a way of dazzling anyone who walked its streets at night. Neon lights shimmered on the Thames, red double-deckers rolled by, and the city pulsed with the hum of stories unfolding in every corner. For Ethan and Amara, it wasn't the city that felt electric, it was the silence between them. They had left Grace with a trusted hotel nanny for just 2 hours. Ethan had insisted, almost awkwardly. "You deserve a break," he'd said. "Not just as Grace's miracle worker. As you." So they walked. No chauffeur, no boardroom, no stroller. Just two people wandering down Southbank, the sound of the river folding into their footsteps. Amara wrapped her scarf tighter against the cool air. "I still can't believe I'm here. London. A city I used to see only in movies. Now I'm walking its streets with—" She stopped herself, unsure how to finish. "With who?" Ethan pressed lightly, his eyes catching hers. "With a man who doesn't seem real sometimes," she said, her smile soft but tinged with disbelief. He laughed, shaking his head. "Trust me. I'm real. Too real. Flawed. Messy. You just haven't seen that part yet." Amara tilted her head. "I've seen enough to know you're not the mask you wear in those meetings. Grace already proved that." Her words landed with a weight he couldn't brush off. He slowed, stopping near the edge of the river where the lights of Tower Bridge glowed like something out of a dream. For a long time, neither spoke. They simply stood side by side, the city spread wide before them. Then Ethan's voice broke the stillness. "You changed something in me, Amara. On that plane. I thought it was just about Grace. But it wasn't. You reminded me of who I used to be before all this." He gestured vaguely at the skyline, at the invisible empire behind it. "And I don't know why, but I don't want to lose that." Amara's throat tightened. She wasn't the type to swoon at words, but she felt the rawness in his tone, the way he wasn't trying to impress her. He was letting her see the man beneath the armor. "Ethan," she began, but her voice trailed off. He turned to her fully then, close enough that she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but also the unguarded light within them. For a heartbeat, the space between them vanished, charged with something unspoken. She stepped back first, her voice steady but soft. "We should go. Grace will wake soon." He didn't argue. He only nodded, though his gaze lingered longer than it should have. As they walked back, side by side, neither spoke. But the air between them was no longer the same. A quiet spark had been lit, small, fragile, undeniable. And both of them knew, sparks had a way of becoming fire. The rain returned the next evening, tapping softly against the tall windows of the suite. Grace was already asleep, her tiny breaths steady in the crib. The world outside buzzed with London's endless rhythm, but inside the suite, it was quiet, intimate in a way that made the silence louder than noise. Ethan sat at the dining table, papers spread before him, but his eyes weren't on the numbers. They were on Amara, who was carefully folding a blanket by the crib, moving with the same quiet grace she had carried since the plane. "You make it look so easy," he said finally. She glanced back, puzzled. "Folding a blanket?" He shook his head. "No. Carrying the weight of the world without letting it crush you." Amara stilled, the blanket in her hands. For a moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she sat across from him. "It's not easy. Some nights I break. I just don't let anyone see it." Her eyes lowered. "If I fall apart, who takes care of the people who depend on me?" The honesty in her words cut deeper than any investor's demand. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What about you, Amara? Who takes care of you? She looked up then, and something in her expression shifted, walls cracking, vulnerability seeping through. No one, she whispered. The room tightened around them. Ethan reached across the table without thinking, his hand brushing hers. It wasn't rehearsed, wasn't calculated. It was instinct. The warmth of his touch startled her, but she didn't pull away. I don't know how to be that for anyone, Ethan admitted, his voice low, raw. But I want to try. Her breath caught. For a long moment, the world shrank to the space between their hands. Then Amara gently pulled hers back, not in rejection, but in caution. Her voice was soft, trembling on the edge of something new. Ethan, don't promise what you're not ready to give. He nodded slowly, accepting her truth. But the look in his eyes told her he was ready. Maybe not with perfect words, but with something real. They sat in silence again, yet the silence had changed. No longer distant, but charged, alive. Grace stirred softly in her crib, and both glanced at her, then back at each other, as if realizing at the same time that this fragile triangle had already begun to bind them. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the walls inside him bend. And Amara, though cautious, felt a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. When the walls begin to fall, even quietly, there's no stopping what waits on the other side. The final day in London arrived with a strange stillness. Ethan's meetings were done, contracts signed, and Grace slept peacefully after a week that had changed everything. Yet for him, the real negotiation, the one that mattered most, was happening in silence, inside his own chest. Amara stood by the window, the city stretching endlessly beneath her. She held her notebook again, the one filled with sketches of a health center, with dreams she never dared to speak aloud until now. She didn't notice him watching. Or maybe she did, but chose not to turn. You're leaving tomorrow, she said softly, her eyes still on the skyline. Yes. His voice carried weight. And so are you. She finally faced him, brows drawn. We go back to separate worlds, Ethan. Yours is made of skyscrapers and boardrooms. Mine is made of strength, he interrupted, and purpose, and truth. Things my world is starving for. Her lips parted, but no words came. Ethan stepped closer, not rushing, just closing the distance with quiet certainty. Amara, you came into my life by chance. You calmed my daughter when I couldn't. You spoke truths in a room full of people who only knew numbers. You reminded me I'm more than what I built. And I don't want this to end at Heathrow. Amara's eyes glistened, torn between disbelief and the fragile hope blooming inside her. Ethan, I can't be another passing chapter in your life. He shook his head firmly. You're not. You never could be. I don't know what this is yet, but I know it's real. And I know Grace already chose you before I did. At the mention of Grace, Amara's resolve faltered. She glanced at the crib, at the baby stirring, and felt the pull of something bigger than circumstance. She whispered, almost to herself, I dreamed of building a center for children who have nothing, and now I'm standing in front of a man who could make that dream possible. Not a man who will hand it to you, Ethan said quickly, catching her eyes again. A man who will stand beside you while you build it. On your terms. Because that's the only way it matters. Tears slipped free then, silent, unguarded. And when Ethan reached for her hand, she didn't pull away this time. The silence that followed wasn't charged with tension anymore, it was filled with release. With possibility. With something neither had planned, but both were ready to face. Grace let out a soft cry, as if reminding them she was still there, still the bridge that had brought them together. Amara lifted her from the crib, holding her close, and Ethan stepped nearer, his arm brushing hers. For the first time, it didn't feel accidental. Together, they stood by the window, the city glowing beneath them, a billionaire and a nurse, a man and a woman, strangers turned into something else. Not lovers yet. Not partners yet. But two lives no longer running on separate tracks. And in that fragile, perfect moment, Ethan whispered the truth neither could deny. This isn't the end, Amara. It's the beginning. Back in Chicago, the rhythm of life returned. Traffic, work, responsibilities. Yet for Ethan and Amara, nothing was the same. He returned to boardrooms with Grace sometimes on his lap, no longer hiding the part of himself he once thought was weakness. And when investors asked about his shift in vision, he smiled quietly, remembering a voice that had spoken of dignity over numbers. She went back to the clinic and her studies, more determined than ever. Only now, her notebook wasn't just filled with sketches and impossible budgets. It carried real plans, backed not by charity, but by partnership. On evenings when their paths crossed, sometimes in his world of glass towers, sometimes in hers of crowded waiting rooms, Grace was always between them, the proof of what had brought them together. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. Some bonds are too deep to measure in days or declarations. But anyone watching could see it clearly. A billionaire who had found his soul again. A woman who refused to be invisible. And a child who had unknowingly written the first lines of a story none of them would ever forget. The future wasn't certain, but it was theirs. Together.